Welcome, everyone, to our webinar entitled Resistant Antibodies, Creative Responses to COVID-19, which is co-organized by New York University's Department of Art and Public Policy in the Tisch School of the Arts and the Gray Art Gallery. My name is Lucy Oakley. I'm head of education and programs at the Gray. As many of you in the audience already know, the Gray, like other museums in New York City and across the US and the world, closed down in mid-March to help contain the spread of coronavirus. In tonight's program, a panel of artists and curators will examine, through the lens of artistic practice, the severe impacts of the virus on the lives of individuals and their communities. At the Gray, we have long been unable to welcome visitors in person to the gallery or to the public programs that we've organized on Zoom. Instead, we've been reaching out to bring you a rich array of online features, and I encourage you to visit the Gray's website and check these out. Before we begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to several people whose enthusiasm and support for this program has been essential to realizing it. First of all, to Pato Hebert, Associate Clinical Professor and Chair of the Department of Art and Public Policy in NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, who brought the idea for resilient antibodies to me months ago and who is our moderator tonight. As a huge and long-term fan of Pato's, naturally, I said yes right away. I would also like to extend heartfelt thanks to several of my Gray colleagues, to Lori Duke for moral support, to Allegra Favilla for helping to promote tonight's event on the Gray social media, and last but certainly not least, Eric Oresek for managing technology behind the scenes. We could not present our webinars without him. I'm also immensely grateful to our speakers, Leila Amatullah Bahrain, Cesar Garcia Alvarez, and Ted Kerr. Before we begin, a word about today's program. It will last for about an hour and 15 minutes. Pato, our moderator, will begin with an introduction framing tonight's panel discussion, followed by brief talks by Cesar, Leila, and Ted. Then all the speakers will engage in a panel discussion. At the end, Pato will pose audience questions. You can submit a question anytime by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have turned off the chat feature, but feel free to send comments through the Q&A also. The program is being recorded and will be posted on the Gray's website with closed captions in the near future. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Pato Hebert. In addition to his role at NYU, Pato is a visual artist, educator, and cultural worker. He splits his time between New York City and his creative studio in Los Angeles, where he is right now. Pato was born in Idaho Falls, Idaho, spent his childhood there, and also in Eugene, Oregon. He also lived in Panama, where his mother is from. He joined the Art and Public Policy Department at NYU in 2012, and before that, he taught at a number of other universities, including Reed College, Scripps College, and the University of California, Irvine. There's so much more to tell you about Pato, but in the interest of time, I will refer you to the short bios of all the speakers, and I'll post a link to that in the chat shortly. I'll now gladly pass the mic to Pato.
Thank you, Lucy, so much. And thank you, Lori and Eric, for all your support. It's great to be back with the Gray, and especially for this program. I want to begin by thanking each of you in the audience for making time in your busy and stressful lives to be with us tonight. It's so marvelous of you to join, and we feel you right here with us. I'd also like to take a moment to honor Lucy Oakley. She's always been such a tremendous collaborator and partner with myself and the Department of Art and Public Policy, welcoming us to conceive of programming and performances, dialogues, and outright creative shenanigans at the Gray. And I'm so grateful to Lucy for her support and for her spirit. I believe tonight Lucy is leading her very last public program for the Gray. And after decades of tremendous leadership, brilliance, creativity, and service, Lucy will be retiring at the end of this fall semester. If we were all in person, I'd ask you to stand and join me in applauding Lucy's power and contributions. If we were in the Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch version of Zoom, I'd ask you all to unmute and make a whole lot of noise. But since we're in webinar format, as you sit in your home or your car or your office, please raise a toast with me in honor of the incomparable Lucy Oakley. Lucy, I will miss you greatly, but I'm so thrilled for you to get your reading on and to spend as much time with your books and your family and beloved landscapes as your retiring heart desires. Thank you so much. As all of you may have heard on the news, we're now at over 10.3 million infected by the coronavirus here in the United States, 51.2 million human beings worldwide. In this country, we've lost 240,000 people to COVID-19, and globally, the death toll is a staggering 1.27 million. My heart is broken by this vast and ever-expanding ocean of loss, and I would like to ask you to join me in taking a moment of silence for our dead. Tonight, I also want to consider what nourishes and feeds our resilience. What are the antibodies for that which ails you? Who and what relations? What other life forces or elements? What practices and principles are sustaining you through these impossible times? Tonight, I hope that we might honor our resilience, our antibodies, and our creativity together. Having said that, I want to state clearly how upset I am that our resilience is so necessary. The outgoing administration's levels of neglect, cruelty, and misinformation have exploded this pandemic in ways that are appalling, dangerous, and destructive. We know the limits of institutions, which is why we must hold them and one another to account. We also know the power of our shared resilience and mutual aid. I wish that our mutual aid and our grassroots efforts weren't so necessary in the face of so much state neglect. But I'm encouraged and emboldened by the ways in which we have mobilized, looked out for one another, cared for, and saved me. I'm what is known as a COVID long hauler. Tonight I'm wearing my long hauler t-shirt, which is part of a fundraiser for the grassroots organization, We Are Body Politic. Early in the pandemic, many of their members became infected, so they realized they needed to set up a COVID-19 support group and Slack channel for information flows and support. It now has tens of thousands of members, including myself. I also want to shout out Hannah Way, who created the COVID-19 practical home care site and has also been instrumental in working with others to develop patient-led research into COVID symptoms and recovery. I'm also a member of multiple support groups on Facebook, all of which were set up by ordinary folks through grassroots efforts during the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, when it was just so difficult to get support from the medical establishment, who were learning on the fly and did not understand the intensity and extent of long COVID symptoms, challenges, and experiences. This is a selfie that I made on March 24th, when due to possible exposure, I was able to get one of the first tests at a public health site in Los Angeles' Elysian Park. This is the mask I was tested in. This is the result that came via email weeks later. But I'd already learned from a phone call that I was positive on March 27th. I soon told my loved ones and inner circles. The next day I went public on social media to help counter the silence, stigma, and disbelief around this virus. On April 3rd, I posted, quote, "I no longer understand time. My temporal intuition and rhythm are shot. COVID-19 day feels like a dog year. So much happens, alters, inspires, unnerves, exhausts, helps, evolves, devolves, accelerates, competes, intensifies, heals, unravels, overwhelms. exhales. 2 days later, on April 5th, I had to visit urgent care because my breathing had grown tight. A few weeks later, I was feeling just well enough to get out of bed and take a hesitant, slow 15-minute walk in Elysian Park, the same place where I'd first tested, the place where I began trying to put my lungs and my spirit back together, the place where I began using my mobile phone to make 2 bodies of ongoing work, the Disembodied series and the Lingering series. In May, I started to write with my friend, the feminist and media studies scholar and AIDS activist Alexandra Juhasz. In a piece that eventually came out in Bomb, we wrote, quote, "When you're inflicted with COVID-19, all of your corporeal compasses can skew. The virus and your human response to it make it hard to know whether what you're feeling is allergies, a mere cold, psychosomatic, or the very real effects of stress. This becomes particularly disorienting when you've suffered through clear symptoms that eventually recede, only to reemerge. We've found that learning from each other, listening to each other, having our symptoms reflected and augmented by those expressed by another, are all forms of confirmation more validating than any test. COVID-19 sufferers find bodies and buddies to authenticate our lived experience and what is patently true in our own bodies. Daily, seemingly unceasing stresses and previously unfelt assaults. Science is only beginning to learn what we have been living, just how complex and uneven recovery with COVID-19 can be. Recovering, a process, ongoing, so different from that shifting beacon of being already recovered. With COVID, it seems that sometimes there is no easy past tense, only a long and frustrating lingering. This means living with the virus's episodic and unsettling resurgence. Trust and optimism easily erode here. Confusion reigns in this dispiriting place and time of coronavirus recovering. Health feels unfinished, uncertain, incomplete. This is a different kind of flattening. So much talk of spikes, surges, waves, plateaus, hotspots, curves. Just as regions and cities are now in varying states of opening up, often only to close back down, we, the infected, are in various states of recovering. The country is nowhere near fully reopened, and we are nowhere near fully recovered. Instead, we live in a messy and ambiguous unfolding. All of this is turbocharged by the raging pandemics of poverty and racism. COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. Pato and compañeras have come to call it living la vida loca, living the crazy life. The Rona can make existence feel even more fragile and precarious. It can cause the possibility of thriving to feel eclipsed by the exhaustion of surviving. This is what makes networks of imagination, action, resilience, and mutual care so crucial, particularly in the face of federal disregard, chaos, and neglect. And Alex and I published this in July. Many of us, including Ted Kerr, who's part of tonight's program, have been thinking a lot about historic and contemporary modes of organizing, creating in response to viruses and loss, desire and dis-ease. When thinking about tonight's conversation, I was wrestling with lots of different titles, and I kept coming back to the seminal 1990 catalog and exhibition Ecstatic Antibodies, Resisting the AIDS Mythology by Tessa Boffin and Sunil Gupta. The text on the back of their book reads, "Different voices reveal the profound inadequacies of our attitudes to disease. The contributors disrupt the politically laden mythology of HIV and AIDS and affirm the persistence of love and desire in the face of death. More than an interruption to personal life, AIDS has stimulated an eruption of creative life. By wresting control of the imagery of AIDS, Ecstatic Antibodies demystifies icons like the nation and the family and illuminates attitudes to gender, sexuality, racial, and moral diversity," end quote. And if you read the book in the introduction, they speak of their collective and their collaborative deliberations, this process they went through in building this exhibition and the book. They note, quote, "Everyone agreed that intervention in the cultural arena was necessary," unquote. And this book came out in 1990, and its name, Ecstatic Antibodies, honors the work of featured artist Rotimi Fani-Kayode. He was born in Lagos and was a dynamic diasporic gay artist. He studied in the US and he was active in Brixton, London until his too premature death at the young age of 34 from a heart attack while recovering from AIDS-related illness. The book features many of his innovative artworks, including the cover image you see on the left, as well as the image on the right, which is from 1989 and is titled Every Moment Counts, parentheses, Ecstatic Antibodies. Another artist and activist featured in the book is Tessa Boffin, who worked in England and was one of the curators and editors of the project. Her series Angelic Rebels, Lesbians and Safer Sex, also from 1989, was way ahead of her time. She was a gender radical and sex and health activist who was frequently shunned by her own queer community, not ready for the future that she already embodied. The book came out in 1990. 3 years later, she took her own life while still in her mid-30s. Her work was challenging and groundbreaking in her own time, and I'm sad and upset to say it remains too little known in ours. The project's other organizer was Sunil Gupta, who thrives as a world-renowned photographer to this day. Ecstatic Antibodies features his No Solutions series. And I remember encountering all of their work when I was a young artist and HIV organizer. I felt riveted and challenged and inspired by this book. And in 2008, 18 years after Ecstatic Antibodies came out, I was working full-time in community-based HIV efforts at AIDS Project Los Angeles, and had the privilege of publishing Sunil's work in an issue of our art journal Corpus, which was edited by the poet Andy Kwan. We published two bodies of Gupta's work, Exiles from 1986, when he photographed gay men in the context of well-known sites in India at a time when homosexuality was still illegal. And he made this work just prior to working on Ecstatic Antibodies. 3 years after that book came out, Ecstatic Antibodies, Sunil himself seroconverted, and he's been living with HIV and making vibrant, dynamic work ever since. We also featured his series, Mr. Malhotra's Party, which began in 2007 and presents portraits of out queer men, also in public spaces in India, but with a very different body language and in a very different cultural moment. So in considering these connections and changes across continents and time, pandemics and problematics, and in thinking about tonight's gathering, I wanted to honor the past while asking two questions. One, how might we ensure that our resilience is not merely some kind of trap laid by late capitalism and the negligent state? Two, is it too early in La Vida Loca, this crazy COVID life, to imagine and enact the ecstatic? I think the creative folks we're going to hear from tonight will illuminate us with their work. As an artist and an organizer, I've needed to create during the first year of the pandemic, however modestly, and I've needed to do so with others. As Boffin, Gupta, and Fani-Kayode knew, intervention in the cultural arena is crucial. We need artists and we need art to help shape the frameworks by which we understand and respond to COVID-19. This is even more urgent in a pandemic that thrives on inaction and misinformation while generating uncertainty and exhaustion, distance and fear. I'm tired of hospital selfies. Sometimes it feels like doctor's appointments are the only thing on my calendar. The day after tomorrow, I have 2 more visits with different specialists as I struggle to navigate the COVID long hauler maze. The first is with a pulmonologist to try to ascertain why a quote obstruction appeared during my comprehensive breathing exam in September, and why my lungs aren't responding to the albuterol inhaler like they should. The second appointment in a different part of town is with a gastroenterologist. I'm seeking a second opinion. A surgeon has recommended I undergo removal as the remedy for GI rumbles and pains I've been experiencing. I never had these issues prior to COVID. In April, they started happening once per month. In September, I had 3 episodes in 8 days. Sometimes they're up near my sternum. Other times they're over my gallbladder. Still other times they're above my belly button. Still other times my left waistband. And lately they've been taunting me from down near my appendix. My afternoon and early fatigue persist as well. It's not just daylight savings time or the demands of my job, or even the horrific accident I had in mid-October. It's also COVID. My sister says that she sees my neurological disruptions improving, but I still burst into tears multiple times per day. My tears are healthy, necessary releases. They're nothing to be gendered or ashamed of, but they come from the ways in which COVID has substantially rewired my emotional circuitry. It also continues to scramble my memory and my word recall. Yesterday, while teaching my students, I tried to celebrate the upcoming book launch of my colleague Grace Anissa Ali and her important work, Liminal Spaces, Migration and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora. But it came out Ghanaian, not Guyanese. I was embarrassed, and I had to name it as such while also using it as a teaching moment to make legible COVID's impacts. I told my students the story of being in the hospital last month for an accident that wasn't related to COVID. In the weeks since, when I've mentioned this stay to people, I've consistently and mistakenly said, well, when I was in the hotel, instead of saying hospital. Words often outmaneuver and elude me thanks to the ongoing effects of the virus. Hospital, hotel, Guyana, Ghana, COVID, livid. Of course, my students don't need my messy slippages to know. They too have been and are impacted by COVID in countless ways, from the exhaustion of so many online courses and too much screen time to the virus itself and how it's challenged and reshaped their lives, loved ones, bodies, job prospects, world, our shared world. I'll close by saying yesterday, while walking in the park where I first began building my lungs and spirit back in April, the same park where I first tested positive, I encountered and photographed yet another fallen mask. I've been doing so for months as part of the Disembodies series. Not human bodies, not whole bodies, not antibodies, but something else. These disembodies, this lingering, this relentless pandemic demands things of me, us, our moment. May we continue to play and to grow, to flourish and to be fabulous in this haunting space between the wounded and the wondrous, the resilient and the ecstatic. And now I'll introduce our three panelists who I'm so grateful to be in conversation with. The first is Cesar Garcia Alvarez, a curator, writer, and executive and artistic director of The Mistake Room, an international nonprofit art space in Los Angeles. After that, we'll hear and see work from Leila Amatullah Bahrain. She's a documentary photographer who graduated from NYU last May with an MA in arts politics and has already been on demand and on many an assignment ever since, making amazing work, which we'll see. And finally, we'll get to hear from Ted Kerr, who's a writer, artist, and community organizer. The three of you, thank you for being in conversation and community tonight. Cesar, get us going with your work. I can't wait to see it.
Thank you so much for having me and for organizing the event today. I'm an academic by training, a curator by calling, and a writer because I just really know no other way. And when one is asked to speak at events like this, one usually does so from a space of critical distance, privileging what one does rather than who one is. But this year, that's become very difficult for me. So instead today, I'm gonna try something different and share some thoughts and work with you from a space of critical intimacy, acknowledging that my body's always where my work begins and from where my work takes guidance about what it wants to do in the world. This photo is my prologue for 2020. It's 2 boxes full of what I was able to gather at a store right before everything shut down in LA in March. The contents, I think, speak perfectly to the kind of confusion many of us felt. I just come back from a trip to New York and made the decision out of precaution to temporarily close the Mistake Room. And the first days of the quarantine were strange. They blended into one another and everything seemed fuzzy. There was a lot of conflicting information. But a day after I took this photo, I woke up with no sense of taste or smell, and things quickly went from confusion to concern. I wasn't sure if I had a fever because I didn't own a thermometer and couldn't buy one anywhere. I had no cough, so they wouldn't test me because I didn't have the symptoms that at that point we knew about. But then I lost my appetite and the nausea came and my body ached everywhere. And I found myself needing to sleep for almost the entire day. I finally got a thermometer and it read 101.3 to 102, but still no cough. And I couldn't get tested. So the Zoom schedule of meetings started, and I kept telling myself that I was just fighting a cold. If I can get the next slide. But I knew that I was sick, and I isolated myself and thought that I would get through it, but nothing really prepares your body to come undone. Elaine Scarry wrote a book years ago called The Body in Pain. And in it, she writes that to have great pain is to have certainty, and to hear that another person has pain is to have doubt. And she's right. After 8 tolerable days came 5 unbearable ones, and everything in the world around me disappeared. The only thing that was certain was my body and what was happening to it. I kept trying to make sense of it all, and the 2 things in the picture helped. The thermometer gave me some kind of measure of my physical being, and my journal let me record what I thought those measurements meant. My chest got tight, I had difficulty breathing, and I had to lay blankets on the floor next to my bed because when the pressure on my chest got unbearable, only laying down flat on the floor gave me any relief. It kept going for another 3 or 4 days, and eventually my temperatures began to spike up to 104, and with it came the hallucinations. My grandma, who passed years ago, sat at the edge of my bed one night, and I finally broke. One lives through this disease alone, and eventually we all reach our breaking point. I finally was able to get a test and waited 10 days for a positive result. But by then, the symptoms started to subdue, and after a few weeks, I felt better. But my body no longer feels mine. It still feels like a crime scene, like when you're robbed and you're trying to figure out what they took from you. And recovery continues to be slow. And for many of us, it's followed by a second act, one filled with memory lapses, emotional breakdowns, a lack of focus, abdominal pains, difficulty breathing, erratic heart rates, and procedures that I'm still learning to cope with. I mentioned Scarry's book early because I think her propositions in many ways reflect my experience with COVID-19 and what's emerged from it. Scarry argues that pain is unshareable, that it escapes language, and that we can't comprehend it, only live it. And because of that, pain has the capacity to unmake us, to unmake what we know, and that from there stem possibilities for new worlds to be made. The work I've done since I became ill with COVID-19 follows that trajectory. First, I did something to bear witness to my unmaking. Then I did something that challenged what I thought I knew. And now I'm working on something for a very different kind of world. If we can get the next slide. After a long period of being unable to find a direction into how to begin working again, I got an invitation to organize an online exhibition for a gallery in New York City. I rejected the invitation at first, and I wasn't sure that I could complete the task, but eventually it became one of the first opportunities I had to begin to make sense of things. I was tired of people talking about this condition as charts and numbers and statistics and policies and shutdowns. I was interested more in the solitude that's induced by this virus and the intimate dimensions of it, in the monsters that it was awakening, the ones that we run away from through our work and our travel and our busy schedules, and that now in quarantine, many would have to face. So at first, I began to think about what this disease looked like. And my writing during this time when I was journaling was choppy at best. So I turned to who I usually turn to for clarity, a group of artists whom I've worked with and whose work via images helped complement a series of entries into a form of visual essay project. These are 2 representations of illness by a photographer in Los Angeles named Star Montana and a work by a New York-based artist named Felipe Baeza. And these images, more so than functioning like a conventional exhibition, were ways for me to begin to grasp at how to describe the experience. So after not seeing many images of other bodies that were beginning to look ill like mine, I also began thinking, if I can get the next slide, about the grief and mourning that would happen alone for many, and the next slide, and about the spaces in which people would quarantine in, and about what those kinds of embodied experiences tell us about the very quiet and different lives we all live and the inequities that define them. These are also photographs by Star Montana. If I can get the next slide. And I looked for images of bodies that were dissolving and disappearing, bodies that were always in the process of becoming, or that had morphed into something unrecognizable. If I can get the next slide. So works by an artist, Liat Yosifor. And the next one. And then at some point, I also began to try to think of images of what estranged bodies would look like, bodies that felt foreign to ourselves, that felt like they were dependent on other conditions or that we were always trying to come to terms with. These are works by Mark McKnight and Felipe Baeza. If I can get the last slide. And after some point of beginning to be able to find a voice and find conditions in which to work in, I also began to think about what my own work would look like as a curator, and also how that would inform the work that we would do in the institution that I direct. This is a work by Tuan Andrew Nguyen that is an abstracted landscape, and I've been thinking often about this very real inability to resume to writing and doing work. And for those long haulers, I think particularly creative folks, one of the most difficult things we've been experiencing are the neurological side effects of the disease, the inability to focus, to write, to go to sleep, that are beginning to impact our work. So I thought this was another work included in that exhibition. And after this project, if we can go to the next slide, I began to try to sort of come to terms with what I would do next and the kinds of projects I wanted to do after this experience. And thinking about questioning what I had, or what I thought I knew, I wrote a few series of prompts and almost exercises that would get me back into my ability to engage with art again after an extended period of illness. And the first project I sort of embarked upon was trying to reimagine what an art history would look like without men, and looking particularly at different artistic movements throughout the global South, just as a sort of simple, almost capacity building tool again, to learn how to re-engage with pictures and images and objects. So on my Instagram, I began sharing daily an image of an artwork by a female artist from involved or very iconic or important artistic movements. That's become an ongoing thread that really sort of allowed me to begin a research process again. And it was silly at first, but I think it's, it's something I haven't talked about before. And I think this is perhaps the most difficult challenge as a curator and writer, at how impacted our ability to think and process has become for us long haulers. And these sort of self-organized exercises were a very kind of bare attempt at me to try to grasp what it would be like to engage with art again. But after being able to return to working with art, okay, has to come working with artists. If I can get the next image. And this is what I'm working on now, which is I'm organizing my first full-fledged exhibition since I became ill. And it's for a project in the Coachella Valley that will open in February of 2021 called Desert X. It's a large-scale site-specific biennial. And while I can't share too much information on the project yet, what I can say to you right now is that in this process of unmaking and trying to remake again, a few things became clear. That finding and being able to cite myself in my work has become a priority. That looking for the objectivity that usually drives curatorial work doesn't necessarily seem relevant at a time when we're trying to relearn what it means to come together with others, to share space with individuals, to have moments of meaningful exchange, to have contact. The stigma and shame that comes with having been infected with COVID-19 is real too. And so part of this process of exhibition making for this biennial will open up longer histories of contagion, thinking about histories of disease and former pandemics, how it impacts the work of artists, and how we learn to make place. After so many years of thinking about the art world and the way that we produce as a globalized network society dependent on constant movement, relearning what locality may mean will be a central part of this exhibition. This isn't a show for everybody, and not everything in this exhibition is also an object. And I think that those particular things for me begin to chart out a new way of working that perhaps prioritizes exercises that for too long I've been afraid to engage in, but that right now seem like such a critical necessity for our survival. In February, I hope those of you who can will come and see this kind of new format of exhibition that very much, I think, will unveil also other ways that we can continue doing our work while adhering to a very new reality.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. My name is Layla Amatullah Bahrain. I am a documentary photographer. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I was born. I'm grateful to be here this evening and also grateful for the invitation. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for everyone in the audience for coming this evening. I'm going to share some of the documentation that I've done this year, starting around late February, March, going from my observations with COVID in New York City to how we adorned ourselves, quote unquote, and adapted to wearing masks, and visiting Minneapolis, first as an observer, then as a journalist on assignment, and my time in Louisville, and a few things in between. So I'm gonna share my video, I'm gonna share my screen with a slideshow that I created for you all so we can chat about all of this. Here we go. So as I mentioned, my name is Layla Amatullah Bahrain. I'm a documentary photographer and art politics alum, class of 2020. So New York City was the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. And in March of this year, we got the news and saw the effects of, the virus spreading around the city. And on the news and in the media, what we saw first was a lot of the scenes around the hospitals, mainly in the city and some in Queens. But I was very interested in the neighborhoods in Brooklyn, particularly neighborhoods that are generally underserved and underreported, like neighborhoods like Brownsville, East New York, some parts of Bed-Stuy, Flatbush, Canarsie, and those neighborhoods. And I'm actually from Brownsville, so I remember growing up and kind of knowing and feeling that where I was living was very distant from Center City, Manhattan, or neighborhoods like downtown Brooklyn or Bed-Stuy that was a little bit more in the media and more in general conversations about New York City. But I remember feeling a definite disconnect. So when COVID came around, I went to those neighborhoods. I went to back to where I was grew up. This is one of the first images that I made. This is actually in Bed-Stuy this is actually in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. And I saw this gentleman, I saw a line of people lining up to this gentleman. And I went up to him to see, what they were doing, why they were lining up to him. And this is what I saw. He was rationing off alcohol, rubbing alcohol, because at that point, there was nothing on the shelves. There was no sanitizer, alcohol, cleaning supplies. There was definitely any mask. anything. So, I mean, this kind of blew my mind because this was like, here, this is where we are at this moment. You know, we have this virus, and even the smallest ways that to protect ourselves are not available to us. So I made this photograph of him. He was rationing the alcohol, as I mentioned, into these small perfume bottles and selling them for $1. And people were lighting up, you know, because there was, as I said, there were no alcohol and anything like that in the store. So I made this photograph, and I thought it was very like symbolic of where we were at the time. So this is March. And so I went around, you know, my neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are mostly Black and brown folks, and seeing, just observing what was happening. And I made this photograph right before the city shut down. And so people, there had been rumors that the city would shut down, and spoke to this woman, and she was getting her hair done because no one knew how long it would be, what we would have access to. And as we saw, everything pretty much shut down, except essential businesses, mainly food, pharmacies, etc. But there were certainly no barbershops or salons in. So this is one woman getting her hair done for the last time. That was her priorities. And so when the city did shut down and only restaurants and, you know, central businesses were opening, we saw some of the mechanisms that were put in place for safety. So this is in McDonald's in East New York. I made this photograph. Masks weren't mandated yet, so this is still late March. And I would go outside at night and the daytime, but mostly at night, to see what people were doing, who was outside, what outside looked like, because outside was closed. There was no more outside, you know, as they say. And so I ran into this young man, smoking a shisha, of course. And I was speaking to him, and he was just like, well, you know, this is our quote unquote new normal. This is how I am going to entertain myself. You know, there's no nightlife. So here's my nightlife, you know, outside. So it was really interesting to see the ways people were kind of adapting to a city that is shut down and a pandemic that we were living in. So I would be outside at night. These are two women who were coming home from Trader Joe's. They work at Trader Joe's. They were waiting for the bus to go home. And I would have small conversations with them, the people who I would encounter, social distancing, of course, and just hear thoughts and what people were thinking and feeling, and their experiences with the virus. And so as I went around too, a lot of the death rates were increasing. And this is a photograph I made in front of a funeral home. The funeral homes had become inundated with family members wanting to, you know, bury their loved ones. And this photo says, "Dear community, we have been forced to close early due to an overflow of cases. Sorry for any inconvenience. We will open tomorrow after 10. Thank you, management." And so this particular funeral home in Bed-Stuy couldn't even take any more clients that day. And so at that time, I was put on assignment for Vox magazine, looking at funeral directors in Brooklyn. And this is a funeral director that I followed. This establishment is on Coney Island Avenue near Midwood, Brooklyn, and mostly conducting a lot of religious centered burials. So many Jewish families use this establishment. So we spoke, and I followed her for some time to see what her job looked like during this time. And here are two more funeral directors that I was engaged with, you know, and really talking to them about what it's like to mourn, because obviously we weren't gathering in person. Many of the ceremonies were online on Zoom. And if they were in person, there was just like, you know, immediate family members, only 5, and then social distancing setups in the establishments. And so the woman on my left, this is a funeral home in East New York, and she was telling me that one woman came in and I think about 7 of her family members passed away from the virus. And she wanted the client was just so sad and this, just overwhelmed with this fact. And this funeral director, she knew she wasn't supposed to hug the woman, but she did. She was just like, we are mourning, I'm gonna extend a hug to this woman. It's the very least I can do. I know it may be irresponsible, but this is what I'm going to do. And she said, just overflowing of people coming in every day from open to close. And so I was, interested in talking to funeral directors in how we mourn, how we bury our dead, how we bury our loved ones who passed away. And not too long after that, masks were mandated in New York City. But at first, we were wearing surgical masks, but people began to get creative, and I started to document that. And Vogue magazine reached out to me and asked if I would document some of the creative ways people are wearing and adjusting to wearing masks in New York City. And this is what I did. I went out for about 2 weeks, all over Brooklyn mainly. Here are 2 more images from the series. So, people were still wearing surgical masks, but perhaps matching them, like the woman on the right and the woman on the left, of course, kind of upping that with a Louis Vuitton inspired mask. And just kind of speaking to people, these are, what people are feeling, what's happening. So I had a lot of conversations. I feel like I was out more during this time than any other time. I was so curious about the world, New York City, being the epicenter of the pandemic and what was on everyone's mind, who was outside. And so after that, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and I went there curious about the community, the response, the history, and I really wanted to just witness the response to this horrific murder. And I wanted to engage with some of the activists that were in the city, and that's what I did. So I did a lot of street portraiture. I did a lot of interviewing and just kind of, witnessing and recording what I saw and what I felt. And this is a young woman in North Minneapolis, just kind of walking around. It was pretty random. It was late at night. She was walking around and just saging the city. Here is, I was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and this was actually at a sit-in that was organized by high school students. Another thing that was interesting, many of the Black businesses were being targeted in North Minneapolis. So I stayed a few nights with one of the neighborhood watch. It was a few neighbors who owned firearms. It's an open carry state and would just kind of patrol and keep a lookout on vigilantes who were targeting and shooting into some of the Black businesses in North Minneapolis. So again, speaking to people and making photographs, I was interested in some of the Muslim community there too. And the woman on the right, she was at her mosque actually became like a huge center for distributing goods and assisting people with whatever was needed during that time because the city had been shut down because of the pandemic. And then everything was shut down again, and even further because of the responses to the murder of George Floyd. So a lot of the businesses were closed and boarded up. And so this mosque took it into their responsibility to assist with the community. And on the left is Brother Ali, who is an incredible thinker and gave me some great insight on just kind of the ideas around whiteness and guilt and the response and kind of thinking about, the city of Minneapolis. So we had a great conversation. I posted that on my IG recently. So if you want to check out an excerpt from that conversation. This, I was on assignment when I was in Minneapolis for the New York Times. And this image is from George Floyd's memorial. This is one of the more quiet moments from his memorial in Minneapolis, which is very much a very dynamic, uh, star-studded event, of mourning and of questioning and of, being present. Another thing I did was also on assignment in Minneapolis. I was interested in some of the Black diaspora communities that live in Minneapolis. So here was a story I did for the Times on the Somali community and their experiences with racism and discrimination. And then I was back to New York and found myself in Louisville, was always interested in witnessing and speaking to the community to kind of get a more rounded story of what I was witnessing, what we were witnessing and seeing on the news. So I was interested in Breonna Taylor and her story, the city of Louisville, and this is on the right is a picture of her mother, and on the left is a picture of her aunt. Yep. This is the March on Washington that happened in August. And I'll end with something, a little bit lighthearted. I was on assignment for the New York Times on the first day that the barbershops opened. And so this is a gentleman before and a gentleman after. So thank you for my talk, listening to my talk. And I'm gonna stop sharing now for the next panelist. Thank you again.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ted, and I will just do a little visual description of myself while I share my screen. I'm a cisgendered white guy. I'm bathed in green light. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and a black hat. And I'm going to be momentarily sharing my screen with you. I'm currently in New York, which, as many of you may know, is on Lenape land. I'm originally from Canada. And before I get started in my presentation today, I want to say thank you to everybody who made tonight possible, specifically Pato for this invitation. Listening to Leila and Cesar share their amazing thought process and work and life experience might be inspiring to a lot of you to think about what you've been going through these last 7 to 8 months. And so I find these questions to be useful when thinking about how to make it through COVID. Ask yourself, what did you do? Why did you do it? What would you do differently? And what is needed now? And I have to say that this invitation from Pato allowed me to do that. And I'm grateful for that. So I'll be speaking for myself a bit. I'm a writer and an organizer and someone who makes art sometimes, but my main place here is I will be speaking as a member of What Would an HIV Doula Do? And this is a Zoom screen grab from one of our early conversations in the pandemic. And some of these people have been living with COVID. Some people have been deeply impacted by COVID. This is just a small percentage of our group. We're about 30 people on and off right now. So know that I will be using the royal we with love. So a little bit about who What Would an HIV Doula Do is. How's that English? So from our website, you will learn that What Would an HIV Doula Do is a community of people joined in response to the ongoing AIDS crisis. And you may be familiar with the word doula, maybe somebody who is part of a birth situation or part of a death situation or part of an abortion situation or even gender. There's gender doulas. And we were thinking that a doula is someone who holds space during times of transition, and that HIV is a series of transitions that begin long before somebody gets an HIV test and last long after diagnosis and after treatment and even after death. And we know that since no one gets HIV alone, no one should have to deal with HIV alone. We doula ourselves, each other, institutions, and culture. And foundational to our process is asking questions. And those last two lines are what I'll be focusing on mainly today. And I just want to give a shout out to the doulas in this Zoom space we have together. Not only is Pato a doula, but I think Sir is out there and Alex is out there and Christy is out there. So just know that I see you and love you, and I feel it back. So one of the first things we did very early on was understand that because a lot of us are either living with HIV or have been part of the HIV response for so long, we understood that viruses are often used to keep people apart. And we knew that real power comes when we say that viruses can bring us together. And we came quickly together to figure out how could we make sure that these, even if we couldn't meet in person, that the viruses could create community. And so really early on, this slogan kind of came to us: let's not be afraid of each other. Let's not be afraid of each other. Let's not be afraid of each other. Let's think about how to provide and receive support amid shared illness. That, of course, was a nod not only to the COVID-19 pandemic that was starting to bloom, but also to the ongoing pandemics, whether it's poverty, the war on drugs, and of course, HIV/AIDS. We all know that HIV/AIDS is not over, but the way some people were talking about it at first, you would think that AIDS was a thing of the past. So we held this event called Let's Not Be Afraid of Each Other, March 17th. We thought it was going to be an in-person / online event, but of course the shelter-in-place orders came. So it was an all Zoom event. And I did it with Ripley from Performance Space New York. And we moderated this really beautiful otherworldly conversation in which we invited everyone to go into breakout groups. And we invited people, and there was over 50 people who came, and we invited them to talk about three things. One, discuss the fears and anxiety you are holding right now, discuss the questions and unknowns you are holding right now, and discuss the specific skills you have and the experiences you have that can impact your response to COVID-19. And the idea was just to start unloading and getting stuff off your chest and talking to strangers and talking to people you haven't seen in a while. And a very small snippet of what came up is questions about what is safe, what causes harm, the fears around who may not survive, fear of family, and how to deal with people in denial around COVID that existed then and it still exists now. And then this beautiful thing that the artist Julie Tolentino said: delivery is the new intimacy. And I think about that a lot when we gather in spaces like this to share things. Zoom is delivering us to each other, and Pato has delivered us to each other tonight, for example. We held two more conversations. So the first one was about people. The second one was about space. And we were trying to get used to sheltering in space and thinking about how we might never travel and thinking about all the businesses that were closed. So that was, and thinking about being stuck in a hospital bed or stuck in a sick bed or being away from somebody as they were dying. So we thought a lot about space. And then we thought about time and how the response to COVID-19 was effing with our time. It was really confusing, and you know, all those funny jokes about like, oh, last month was a hard year. So these were kind of these ephemeral events that we did. And around the time that we were doing that, I started to see that so many of the members of What Would an HIV Doula Do were hitting the ground running, actually making art, organizing, writing, making community. And after an invitation from Umi at the One Archive Foundation, we were able to put together a zine that collected all of these examples of how the What Would an HIV Doula Do community was responding to COVID. And so inspired by this, we created a zine called What Does a COVID-19 Doula Do? And as you can see, there was lots of people who responded with writing and images, and I'll share a few. Before I do that, I'll let you know that the zine was rooted in this exhibition that four of us from What Would an HIV Doula Do curated for the One, called Metanoia: Transformation Through AIDS Archives and Activism. And it was this idea that so many of us have been changed by HIV, whether it's through diagnosis or through activism, through both or through more. And Kat wrote this beautiful text. Kat was one of the curators along with Alex Yohas and Joannes and myself. And Kat writes, "What has always been true when it comes to HIV is true now in the era of COVID-19. Queer, trans, people of color communities are particularly vulnerable because of the labor our bodies often perform and the healthcare disparities present in our communities, including in the cities, the rural parts of our country, and of course, inside prisons and jails. Our bodies represent hope, care, grace, and beauty, all things that I want to be present in this time of COVID-19. We also had beautiful work from Ezra and his brother Noah. They're both living with chronic illness, and they used the mask that we got to see Layla's photos of to create text messages to each other. So for example, an army of the sick can't be defeated. I'm going to be going rather quickly through these zines. Know that you can download the zine for free on our website, which is hivdoula.org. We asked some people outside of our community to contribute if we thought that they were doing things that we knew the world needed. For example, the sociologist Stephen Muldrin had given a talk and he had used this slide, and I was so inspired by it. It reminded me of the Denver Principles and the way in 1983, a group of people living with HIV came together to say, we are not victims, we are rarely patients, we are people living with HIV. And Stephen reminded us that we need to use that people first language, at least while we're still figuring out the language. And then of course, Tamara, who is a founding member of What Would an HIV Doula Do, shared this map, this really powerful map of the work that her and Bronx Mobile did. They're a group of activists in the Bronx who, even before the pandemic, were providing harm reduction supplies to people who are homeless or dealing with houselessness and do drugs up in the Bronx. And part of her work was also telling people about COVID and everything that was going on, because a question that Gary Kinsman asks is, who is the public in public health? Often the people who are often already marked for premature death are also left behind when it comes to a pandemic. So Tamara and Bronx Mobile's work was really important inclusion in the zine. Luckily and thankfully, the One Archive said that we should animate these zines through online events. And so there was this beautiful healing event that Umi and Kat did. It was like an early morning meditation. There was tea. I did it outside in the rain. It was quite beautiful. And then our own beautiful Pato gave this wonderful performance lecture, you know, very much in the vein that we got to see earlier. And it was even earlier in Pato's own experience with COVID. And it was very moving for me to see. I'm going a little bit fast because I want to leave time for conversation. We then had our second zine. In between all of this cultural production, we thought it was really important that we just meet as a group of people. I would say that the two tools that What Would an HIV Doula have used is interpersonal relationship and then cultural production. And I think those are, you know, along with, you know, a vaccine and a cure and all those other things, they're really important in a pandemic that you have cultural production and relationships. And we often on our Zoom meetings would talk about everything from like how our kids are doing or how our parents are doing or how our pets are doing. But then we also would talk about like how hard it was to get laid or how annoyed we were with our partners that we lived with, or, you know, we were unsure, like, could we kiss a stranger? Would we ever kiss a stranger again? And that led to the second zine, In Our Bodies. It was edited by Diane Cage and myself with this beautiful list of folks who contributed. Alex F. Paired this beautiful Hugh Steers painting, which was made at a height of the AIDS crisis, with his own experiences of wondering if kissing on a mass kissing on a train was going to be okay. You can see the parallels there. At the end of each contribution in Our Bodies, each person would share some tips on what to do in this moment, but then would also share some more media, because we're all in our houses and there's nothing like giving recommendations to help kind of keep the love and the vibe going. One of the more poignant contributions to the zine for me was by Molly Pearson, who wrote beautifully about having to care for one of her sick guardians who was so instrumental in her life, and her life was already marked deeply by parents living with HIV, and now to have a parent going through health crisis during COVID brought up lots of things, especially around intimacy and love and care and intergenerational dialogue. And this is a photo of one of her guardian's porn collections. Both, this is how she found it, exposed, and then for some modesty, she covered it. Amid all of this work, we were all very finely attuned to the fact that so many people wanted to draw parallels between COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS, and many of us are writers or journalists or scholars, and so we had a vested interest in making sure that this dialogue happened. Of course, make the comparisons, think about COVID and HIV together, but we wanted to be generous. We wanted to doula people's higher selves so that when they started to do the writing, they did it meaningfully. So we asked 27 questions, and we lumped this into your framework, your sources, your subjects, your audience, and your impact. And just like the two zines, these questions can be downloaded for free on our website. We were very lucky that the amazing artist Karen Finley kindly gave us this image that we could use. It was a watercolor that says positive. And then finally, something that we were doing in the last few weeks is we did this project called What Does a 2020 US Election Doula Do? And every day we would post at least 2 of these tiles on Instagram and with the hashtag 2020 US Election Doula. And basically it was our way of providing support for ourselves and each other to both doula what we needed to make sure that whatever the outcome was, we were ready for it. And you can check these out on our Instagram. The last one that we wrote was, what does a 2020 US election doula do? Well, they find solidarity and shared pleasure. They embrace joy and reject patriotism. And I just want to end by saying that I really cherish and love the way that people have been very personal tonight. I know I would not have survived this pandemic even as a COVID negative person without the community of the doulas. We are a large enough community that, you know, I can't remember everyone's name if I was asked to rattle them off, but also it's an intimate enough group that when we did check-ins, it felt like I was meeting with friends and family. And I just want to say that I'm grateful for that. And as we enter this new wave or this new season of pandemic, please join us. You can email us. You can check out our website. Thank you so much. And I'm excited for the conversation that will happen now.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Leila, and thank you, Cesar. I feel really enriched, and like I just want to take a moment to soak in the incredible depth and range of your practices. You are each so different from each other, and your practices are so different, but the weaving and the echoing that starts to happen to me is really very moving. I want to say also that folks who are, I guess we have to say audience, but I want to say compas, as in compañeras, compañeros, you're here with us too. So please use the Q&A to send us your insights or questions, and I'll do my best to weave in. We've got about 20 minutes that we can be together in a conversational space. And I'll start maybe, Ted, near where you left off, this beautiful reminder that tools are important, and the tools of interpersonal relationships and cultural production. And it dovetails with the first question I wanted to ask the three of you, which is, as different as your practices are, it seems to me that in a pandemic where the public health response can require strategic isolation, or that's one thing that public health might ask of us, you each enacted practices that cultivated connection. And I wonder if you could talk about this tension in your work, or at least your work vis-a-vis the world, between isolation and connection, because all of you in your work, but in the way you presented today, were calling forth so many others. And I'm really struck by that creative act of care. And I wonder if you could talk about that amidst the pressure towards isolation that this pandemic puts on us.
Are we wasting precious time being polite?
No.
I'm thinking.
I maybe, I think it's interesting that you framed the conversation around seeking community, because my experience actually kind of needed to embrace that solitude for a bit. And I think my work as a curator, I think, is maybe a bit different than as artists and makers and organizers, because our practice is always an ongoing dialogue in relationship to different needs of artists. I jokingly tell artists that I'm very close to that we wear the hat of like therapist and, kind of resource provider and advisor. And the more your kind of lifelong relationships with artists expand, we're often asked to engage in that kind of work consistently. And at that point of being quite literally sort of not able to do that because your body wasn't operating right, embrace the slowness a bit. I struggled with the idea of when to jump back to a sense of collective work.
Mm.
I didn't want anybody calling me. Like, it was great and it was fantastic, but I didn't necessarily need that at that time. I was really trying to make sense of, I think at first, what was sort of happening to my body, but also about a very drastic change that for somebody whose work meant being on a plane at least once every month and always consistently feeling without having any sense of being grounded. um, I wanted to, I think it was the shell shock for me was what it would mean to be still and to begin to sort of learn how to do tasks that I had sort of outsourced to people because I was always on the go. And so I think the notion of community for me was harder in the beginning. And I think I also was exhausted because I was diagnosed so early. And it was at a time when a lot of people didn't know folks who were COVID positive. Everybody had very annoying questions at a time when it was very inappropriate of what should I be buying, and or calling you because they thought they had it. And you're like dealing with 104-degree temperature. So there was also a moment when I just wanted things to stop. And I don't know if I eased into kind of a desire to invoke for a lot of people into my experience right away.
Mhm, mhm. Wow, it was really interesting. Again, like, I felt a huge sense of anxiety because I began to feel like I took relationships and friendships for granted now that I wasn't able to freely, be with my folks, and I had so many friends and people who I consider family around, like, abroad. So right, even before COVID, I was in the Middle East, in the UAE, and I was in Oman. And I put off some things when I was in that region because, like I said, I'll just come back, I'll go back in May because I wanted to continue some projects I was doing. I couldn't do that. And I, the how I felt around not being able to see folks, that was a very new feeling because, the way we moved around the world, for the most part, depending, was very free. And then I started to think about, people who couldn't isolate, when I went outside, just thinking about people who live close together, people who, the kind of situations that were in housing projects and different situations like that. And, how that, I think those situations were very much overlooked, in telling the story of COVID, in the grand sense of the media as well. And one else thing I wanted to say, just really think, noticing who, going outside at night, and seeing people who didn't have homes, houseless folks, and how when the subway shut down, overnight, and that was a huge resource for a lot of folks who didn't have homes. And also just the company that, my friend was telling me, was kind of pointing this out, like, when we went inside to quarantine, people who are homeless or houseless kind of lost their quote unquote company, like their main source of income, because, when you live in the world, you engage, that's your kind of uh, life, and then we were not there. People were isolated. So, those are the kind of things I thought about and I observed and felt. Yeah. Mhm.
Briefly, I would just say I'm thinking a lot about like ideas and viruses and sex and community, and all of those things are things that I cherish and want. And that means we need connection. And I guess we have to figure out how to deal with those and have those in a different way. and watching all of us talk tonight has given me some ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, Leila, I was struck. You went out. You just mentioned being outside, and you went outside almost immediately, right? Back in February, March, and I love that line when you said there was no outside, right? And then in your comments just now reminded us that the outside is everything. The outside is inside, and then in Minneapolis, the sister who's saging the city, right? And
Yeah.
that weaving that your body of work over the last, let's call it 8 months, 7, 8 months is doing, I think is so important. And I have questions, but I want to ask you, what do y'all want to ask each other? Having seen and heard a little bit about each other's practices, what do you want to
Yeah.
ask each other?
Oh man. I just I was writing some notes about the HIV doula project, which I really love and appreciate that. Um, it just made me think, one of my friends passed away a few years ago and she had a death doula, and I had never heard of that. And this idea of holding space and kind of walking people through and witnessing and being there and supporting a person through a specific moment in time is really intriguing to me. And just thinking about HIV, I grew up in the 80s, and I remember having an uncle who lived with us who had HIV, and this was early in the 80s. So no one had no idea about anything. So we had our plates and he had plastic cups and plates and things like that. And I'm thinking about, like, had he had an HIV doula, what his experience had been like, in navigating, and even, connecting us, the family, with what his experience would be like. So I just really appreciate that. Brought me back to those thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, love to you and your family and your uncle. And we also think about, like, sometimes it's not even the person living with HIV that needs the doula. Sometimes it's their community that needs the
Right.
doula. And I love that you're picking up on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't help but wonder if you used the word observer, Leila, but I thought about your willingness to engage those who were doulaing change, right? In Minneapolis, in Louisville, even in that first picture, I think it was in Brooklyn, might have been Queens, but the brother like rationing, right? And Cesar, when you talked about the multiple hats and roles of the curator, I couldn't help but think a little bit about the dueling you're doing, whether it's the Coachella Valley as it's transitioning so much with climate change and with gentrification, right? Or even Desert X as a kind of way of engaging, but also building these relationships and sustaining them over time with the artists that you work with in your practice. Which isn't to make everybody a doula, but I do find that this notion of holding space for others, including institutions or places in transition, is such a helpful way to think of it, especially against, when I think of disease, ableism and this notion of health as the norm and the thing any of us who somehow have less than that are supposed to get back to, right? But thinking in a much more supple and multi-directional way about what transition is and who and what we need to navigate it together.
Pato, I have a question for all three of you as artists or people who make art in situations, as you said, which is kind of a question around productivity or how much we're meant to be making. And I'm really interested in that, particularly with you, Pato, because you also got COVID very early on. So I feel like for those of us who were kind of early cases and then still are kind of lingering with this, who are long haulers, I feel like we started the race a little bit late. And I feel like there was a lot of, like, right when everything shut down, institutions quickly rushed, and you had the swarm of, like, Zoom online events. And there was this anxiety that I saw a lot of artists respond to by trying to produce often and overly. So I think that, and for me, the experience has been different. I sort of scaled, took a step back in a way, and was trying to figure out when the dust was going to settle and what it would mean to work and operate and best support artists in this way. But have you felt the sort of, as makers, what this sort of expectation or what what the response to like immediately make things in response to this as a way of coping, because I've been thinking a lot about slowness and rest and healing and what productivity may look like while also embracing that.
Mhm, mhm.
Hmm.
It's so interesting. There were these memes going around, during early March about now you have time. There should be no excuse. You should start a Fortune 500 company, or write that book, The Great American Novel, whatever. I mean, it was really interesting, the kind of ideas that was circulating around such a moment, a pandemic, where people felt like that was okay, here's your time. It's vacation time for some, whatever. So get busy on that project, that, as opposed to really being present in what we were experiencing at that time, processing that, so I thought that was really interesting. To be honest, I got caught up in that. I was just like, well, okay, I should be responding to that. And I did respond in my own way. But then at a certain point, I hit against the wall, because I felt the overwhelming, my body was responding separate from my mind and wanting to do all of this stuff. My body was like, no, you have to sit down. You have to process this. Look what's happening around you. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to be out in the street, documenting. You document when it's the right time, when you can handle it, and pace yourself.
Yeah, pacing. Ted, this is something we've talked about many times. Do you have any thoughts on Cesar's question about slowness? Just such a beautiful concept and an important practice, but hard to enact in the cultural sphere and political urgency.
It's hard to enact, especially when the four of us, our practice is service, right? Like one could argue that all that we do, whether we're being a photographer or curating or teaching or making art, we're being of service. So it's so easy to justify overproduction. And so I would love some tips on like, how do we tell ourselves that like, yeah, just chill. And that's actually the nicest thing you can do for yourself and your community.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a comment. We've got about 5 minutes. So if anybody that's with us wants to ask something in Q&A, please do so. I'll try to incorporate before we break. But somebody sent a comment that, yeah, it's really an anti-capitalist practice, right? And I think one of the hardest things, Ted, when we were in service and with others, even inviting the three of you, I had the pang of like, OMG, these three are so busy, so marvelous, so in service of others. Is this going to feel like a burden? And it might, right? And or is it a chance to be in communion? And does it rupture the solitude in a way that's draining, Cesar, when solitude is so important, right? And just I can't look at my inbox. And or is it a way to doula one another? And it's an ongoing question for me, though I've been very, very grateful to be in this space with you tonight. I'm hungry for these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I wanted to point out, Cesar, you brought up something really interesting. There's a Instagram account called the Nat Ministry. There's a woman in Atlanta who just advocates for rest and that anti-capitalist approach. Like, she's always mentioning that we are moving in a capitalistic way. We need to rest. We need to sit our ASS down and rest, pretty much. So,
We are working our next big exhibition project, which strangely enough we began to plan before the pandemic hit, was a big exhibition that looked at the notion of healing in an expanded sense.
mhm,
And rest is in many ways the foundation of various healing practices. And the lack of rest and its connections to colonial projects as a strategy has been a really interesting sort of find. There's a remarkable artist collective you can find online called Black Power Naps
mhm,
that trace back these kind of histories of a lack of rest and tie it directly back to these kind of colonial practices and colonial histories, and very much thinking about, I think even myself, I was guilty of before this, like the kind of self-care economy that I often made poked fun at and thought that was just really another way. It was like another Halloween made by the corporations to try to get us to, buy things or buy services. But I think when you look at it without that kind of cynicism, that I think the productivity and our day-to-day demands, there's a lot to be learned from these kind of broader practices that maybe if we're starting to think about big systemic changes, not just in the art world, but thinking of issues of racial equality and, class inequities, then maybe going back to the basics may be a better starting point than trying to overproduce to compensate.
I really appreciate that, Cesar. And in your comments, when you were showing your work, you talked about my body no longer feels mine. And my colleague Kathy Engel, and maybe we'll close with both of your wisdom, is reminding us of unmaking. And yes, the power of slowness and the body talking. Who are our bodies talking to or for? What do our bodies need? And what does it mean? Take may not be the verb, but to honor our bodies, and against the constant drain and pull, which again is easier said than done. And this gathering tonight for me is that paradox. Like, it's by being together, we're not doing any number of other things, including resting, and yet hopefully we are dueling one another and rejuvenating one another and offering possibilities, so that in rest or work or play, um, we might have the energy and the connectedness that we need, to be in our bodies rather than so displaced. And I have to honor the Gray, whose staff agreed to work overtime to let us talk to this point. I want to thank the three panelists and would invite everybody on the call to join me in thanking this amazing group of people. Thanks again, Lucy, and congratulations on a phenomenal career. Thank you to Lori and to Eric and to everyone on the call. This will be recorded and captioned, and we'll be able to revisit it in a couple of weeks. Much love, everyone.
Thank you.